Remember, a few months ago, I introduced my new miniseries, The Signs. These are basically signs that something may be considered good or bad. And last time I did, I think it was 8 signs that a Ninjago episode may be good. Now I'm gonna go with the opposite, but not as many signs. So here are 5 signs that may indicate the Ninjago episode might be pretty bad. Okay, so the first reason I have is if it's poorly placed in the story. If an episode feels misplaced, it can throw the viewer for a loop, and it can make the viewer a little disoriented as a result. Remember that series? Remember that show, Firefly? You know, that show that's infamous for having the episodes aired in the wrong order? Yeah, that Firefly. It's kind of like that, where it just feels like they put the episode in the wrong order, essentially. 2 episodes that I can name off the top of my head that suffer from this are The Absolute Worst and The Kaiju Protocol, both in the Ice chapter. These episodes were panned by fans, partially due to the fact that their placement in terms of the story feels very off, especially considering it's after some sort of revelation, like after, like for Kaiju Protocol's case, it was placed after the episode My Enemy, My Friend, in which we finally know that Zayd is the Ice Emperor. And then after that, boom, we get an episode that is not focused on the Ice Emperor at all, and is focused on Wu and Pixel. And this could feel very weird for some viewers, because they expect the next episode to focus firmly on this twist and go a bit more in depth about it. But instead, they get an episode that is completely different. You might think it's down to fan expectations, and well, you might be partially right. You can't deny that if an episode is placed in the wrong slot in terms of the actual story and how it's supposed to flow right, it could definitely affect your opinion of said episode. Another sign a Ninjago episode might be considered bad is if it contains offensive/obscene material. I remember a while back there were some people that point out a lot of potentially racist, quote-unquote, material in Ninjago. Like, for example, Master Chen being a very obvious Asian stereotype, and the fact that there's not a lot of Asians that work on the show. But the example that I'm going to use in this case is from my least favorite episode in the entire series, Infamous. You already know what I'm going to say, and that is Derv just being a straight sexist. How in the world this was approved, I do not know. I do not know in what world this was approved on, because I know in any other, anyone who has common sense knows that is not appropriate for kids. Especially because it could get off the wrong way that women are inferior, or girls are inferior to them, and they might take it, an extreme way. So an episode that may contain offensive/obscene material definitely will make you think, how in the world did they approve of this episode? And it really makes you think, why didn't they bother to edit this out or completely rework the episode entirely? Because having offensive and obscene material could potentially put the show and its viewers at risk for potentially cancellation. My third sign is if the episode doesn't really add anything overall. In a sense, it just almost feels like a waste of an episode, where it just feels like, well, what's the purpose of this episode? What does it provide, essentially? If it doesn't provide much, or if it doesn't provide anything, it's essentially what I just said, a waste of an episode. Now, I'll go back to The Absolute Worst and The Kaiju Protocol. The Absolute Worst is complete filler. There's no point that this episode should exist. There's no reason that this episode should exist. Now you may be thinking, what about Fugitive? Fugitive's only popular because of that stupid Twitter account that made him a meme. Alright. Then we have the Kaiju Protocol. I remember some people pointed out how it does actually matter in the course of the grand plot, how it talks about Wu's pessimistic views towards the ninja, and it completes that arc. But the fact that it took someone to point that out is alarming. You shouldn't have to have allowed someone to point that out. You should be able to find that out yourself, because everyone should be able to. Everyone should be able to point these out because they're not stupid. They're not stupid. You can't just call people stupid for not noticing these, but these details are so minor that they can be easily missed. And that's the problem with adding in a little detail in it. You have to add some moderate detail, or because if you add too much detail, you make it a little too obvious, especially for a plot twist. So you have to add in just the right amount of detail, where it's not too obvious, but it's not too obscure either. You have to make it so that it's easy to understand, but also easy to recognize. And while I do think this information about Wu's arc is easy to understand, it wasn't easy to recognize, since it took a lot of people pointing this out and saying, hey, did you notice that this actually resolves this? The fact that people pointed that out is incredibly alarming, and it makes you think, well, why didn't they put more emphasis on that? Or why did they put more attention to that? And it makes you think that the episode in question provides very little when it doesn't. And I don't want people to think that. But there are episodes in the actual series that don't really provide all that much. As I said, The Absolute Worst is a big example of this. Going back to The Absolute Worst yet again, and that is and my fourth reason, unlikable / terrible characters. If the characters are straight up unlikable, then it really makes watching the episode really weird, because you want the characters to grow and develop, but when they are dumbed down, in a sense, for the sake of the plot, it makes it kind of awkward, in a sense. Going back to what I said, The Absolute Worst, there's only 3 characters, well, 4, technically, if you count Pixel. 3 main characters telling this episode. Ultraviolet, who isn't that popular anyway, the Mechanic, who isn't that popular anyway, and the debut of the new character, Fugitive, which, at first, and it isn't with the later support he got in mind. At first, he was, looked on very poorly, because a lot of people thought, why did you add this character, essentially, when he serves no purpose? And, there's a lot of unlikable characters in the series, but that's really a matter of opinion. But if I had to talk about some characters that I don't think are really likable, one that comes to mind, and I know this is unpopular, is Skylar. I don't like Skylar. I don't. She's an incredibly bland character. She doesn't really add anything, and is only there to give Kai a love interest, for which he does not need, honestly. So, I wouldn't say she ruined the experience, but she made watching Season 4 a lot weirder, knowing what happens. And there's more examples that I could provide with this. There's more examples. But I'm not gonna dilly-dally and waste your time with this as I move on to the 5th and final sign, and also the most obvious one. The 5th and final sign, if a Ninjago episode may be bad, is if it has bad writing. This is clearly the most obvious sign, because it kind of encompasses all the previous ones that I mentioned, and also includes some other ones. Like, for example, I know this may be surprising, but an episode that I'm not a huge fan of, but I don't necessarily dislike, is The Forgotten Element from season 4. Am I not such a fan of this episode? Well, it relies heavily on plot convenience. If you don't know what that is, plot convenience is in the name. It's convenient for the sake of the plot. There's no actual explanation to there. It just happens for the sake of it, essentially. And when an episode relies too much on plot convenience, it really questions the writer's integrity in a sense. Because it makes you think, did they actually write this episode? Because there could have been scenarios where they could have explained what happened, but they chose not to. And it really boggles my mind how a lot of people like this episode, despite the fact that it has so much plot convenience. Um, as I mentioned before, unlikable characters. That's another example. Or it may be inconsistent with its own canon. Like, for example, a very famous one is the episode Child's Play, where Zane in his cute child form says Nindroids don't dream. But then when we go back to season 1, I know it was more like a vision, but it kind of falls along the same line. It was in a sense of dream. And even in season 4, he mentions that he does dream. Well, Pixel mentions that he does dream. So he, in a sense, was dreaming, especially since he was asleep while doing that. And visions can be kind of like, can happen but when you're both awake and asleep, so it's kind of like a weird case. But there are some times where it's like inconsistent with its own canon. I remember a lot of people dissed the episode endings because it had a huge amount of plot holes. Like, for example, Kai holding the golden armor and not just boom, instantly dead as a result. Now, Tommy did say that this was because the golden armor was a lot weaker than the one from Rebooted, but why didn't he explain that earlier? That's what I'm wondering. Why didn't he explain that earlier? When, it was kind of obvious. Well, you could say, well, the episode didn't air yet. Well, yeah, but still. There are many more examples of bad writing, but I'm not going to dilly-dally in this. But anyways, do you agree with what I said? What are some other signs that an Ninjago episode might be considered bad? Let me know in the comments down below. But anyways, I hope you guys liked this video. Give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel by clicking the red subscribe button and clicking the notification bell to see every video that I will upload. And I'll see all you folks in the next video. Bye-bye!